All right, hello economics students. So part two in our little revision lecture series, and we're looking at macroeconomics, which I think is the most important to understand, but I think we also find it the easiest, so go figure. If you feel like you're smashing macroeconomics and you've got it, move on to the next part, which will be the difficult part, international economics. But we're going to look at using aggregate demand and aggregate supply to answer goal questions, which I think is really important. So actually you should hang around and do that. Then we're going to do labour force classifications and quickly look at goals now. So remember, strong and sustainable growth. Students get confused with this goal each year. It doesn't mean that we don't have any inflationary pressures in the economy. What it means primarily is we want to grow the economy. That's what you should be thinking when you're trying to make a judgment, which you need to do a lot in an economics paper, let's face it, about whether or not the goal's been achieved. Okay, so we want primarily to increase the volume or the quantity, basically to produce more goods and services from one year to the next. Then, as a bit of a side point, we want it to be strong enough to create jobs. That's the strong component, but not so strong that it puts inflationary pressure on the economy. Sometimes they talk about external environmental pressure. So we're going to look at this on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve, but you just want to be really clear about when it's been achieved and when it hasn't been achieved. Inflation is a side point. It's not the main point of the goal. That would be low inflation, wouldn't it? Got the other two goals here, but I'm not going to go through them. I just felt bad because they weren't there. So this is super, super important. I can't believe I'm doing this in November, but this is October. But this is super important because on the y-axis, we can work out what's happening to inflation. And on the x-axis, we can work out what's happening to strong and sustainable growth and full employment. So if you're someone that sometimes struggles to work out what happens to the goal based on a change in aggregate demand or aggregate supply, which is everything in the macroeconomy, then use this, draw this, annotate this. So firstly, if we increase or decrease on the y-axis, we can say increase in price pressures, decrease in price pressures. Therefore, more likely, less likely to achieve inflation. On the x-axis, we can say increase, if we move to the right along the x-axis, increase in production, increase in real GDP. Therefore, more likely to achieve strong and sustainable growth. We'll come back to the inflation part. Or increase in real GDP, which leads to a derived demand for labour. As businesses produce more, they need more labour, which is likely to improve full employment, or the unemployment rate goes down. So we can do everything to do with our goals on this graph, okay? Just a quick side point, the productive capacity here, the hypothetical productive capacity, which just basically shows us that as the economy moves along the aggregate supply curve and gets closer towards capacity, that's when more price pressures are likely to emerge. That's when we get the high inflation. So you want to be operating, somewhere in this sweet spot here. And that's because as you get closer to capacity, bottlenecks and shortages occur, and therefore prices start to rise quickly. Okay, so let's look at what happens when there's an increase in aggregate demand. Yes, there's some price pressures, but primarily there is an increase in real GDP, which means that yes, we've achieved, or we're more likely to achieve, strong and sustainable growth. Then what you would say is just a side point is, hey, by the way, assessor, there could be some price pressures there because I know how to read an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. So yes, we produce more, it achieves the strong component, but it may put pressure on prices, not sustainable. Okay, something like that. It's not the main point, it's a side point. And if we go the other way, you definitely want to be saying we're moving away from our strong and sustainable growth target or goal. Not that, oh, guess what? Price pressures are going down, therefore we've achieved it. No, that's not the main point. So as an increase in real GDP, we've produced more, that's great. Decrease in real GDP, we've produced less, that's bad. So we're moving away from the strong and sustainable growth target. You may wish to say, however, there'll be downward pressure on prices. The beauty of aggregate supply policy is when we shift the aggregate supply curve to the left, all three goals are achieved: low inflation, strong and sustainable growth, and full employment in the long term. Okay, so this is really important stuff, and it's very common on an exam or in a SAC. And this is a bit of a trick. This is how I sort of write my aggregate demand, aggregate supply questions. So if you can unlock this sort of syntax here, it gives you, or it opens up to a whole range of different questions. You could also use it as a way to practice. So let's go through it. Explain how X, one of these things here, ADAS factor, aggregate demand policy, monetary or budgetary, or AS policy, would impact the achievement of one of our goals. And I'm sure you've seen this before if you're watching this video. You've seen this sort of question before. The beauty is that the way we approach this and there's going to be a huge number of combinations of questions, but the way we approach this is exactly the same. A little bit different for aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So it could be, Y could be any one of our goals, but it could also be living standards. Sometimes that throws students a little bit. Could be economic activity, but that's basically the same as strong and sustainable growth. Last year, they did a range of industries. That definitely threw students. That's just growth in a range of different industries. Jobs and growth was a few years ago. That also threw students. It's the full employment and the strong and sustainable growth target or goal. Okay. So the way we approach this question, given that it could be a number of different combinations, we always outline the factor or the policy. So if it was consumer confidence, well, tell me what consumer confidence is. And this is not a perfect marking guide. This is, imagine that this is like a bit of a structure, call it a 4-mark question. So you want to tell me what the factor is, what the policy is, whether it's aggregate supply or aggregate demand. So outline the policy. Maybe if it's a policy, you want to give a contemporary example. Then you want to explain how X works, that should say with an S. So how does it actually work? If it's consumer confidence, well, it leads to more consumption spending. So in here, we should be talking about which component of aggregate demand it impacts. If it's an aggregate supply factor, well, what is it, or aggregate supply policy, well, how does it work? What does it do? Again, it's not a perfect structure, but you get my point. Then you always need to refer back to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, and you do that by drawing and observing this relationship here. So is it a shift to the right? Is it a shift to the left? Or whatever. Okay, and then we can see what happens to our goal on the Y and the X axis. Okay, so not a perfect structure, but you want to explain how it impacts AD or AS, and you want to draw and observe that to help you. Finally, you bring it back to your goal. Are we more or less likely to achieve it? Okay, labour market classifications. Let's just recall the unemployment rate is the percentage of the labour force, this group here, who are in this basket here, who don't have a job, currently 4.6%. And the participation rate is the percentage of this working age population who is in the labour force, about 66%. Don't quote me on that. Okay, so a couple of things to remember, the relationship between the two. There is a relationship. As we increase the participation rate, so as people, and sorry, I didn't mention before, but there's also this group over here where they're currently, or they're not in the labour force, they're not participating. But as they move towards participating, so as the participation rate increases, that often leads to an increase in the unemployment rate as well in the short term. And that's just because when you move from being not working at all to looking for a job, you start out being unemployed. Okay, but it could also go the other way. If the unemployment rate decreases, the labour market tightens and it becomes a better job market. People who have been discouraged over here from looking for a job, who are hidden, often rejoin the labour force and therefore improve or increase the participation rate. So a couple little relationship things there for you to think of. Okay, finally, there's this question that was on a multiple choice a while ago, but it was a bit tricky and it sort of ruins my theory that you should never get asked maths questions on an economics paper. This is the one exception. But we need to work out basically we need to work out the participation rate and the unemployment rate in year 1 and year 2 and work out which multiple choice answer is correct. So let's go through it. Remember, let's do the unemployment rate first. Remember, the unemployment rate is the percentage of the labour force, these two together, who are in this basket here, unemployed. So we put 2 over 16, and we put 2 over 19. And as I said, we don't have to work the actual number out. We have to work out which one's greater and which one's smaller. So we can see that 2 over 16, I don't need to know that exactly, but I can see that that's going to be a larger percentage than 2 divided by 19. Because with the same amount of people, we're just dividing it into a larger group. So the percentage will be lower. Then the participation rate gets a bit tricky. Remember, that's the percentage of the working age population here, 20, who are in this group here, the labour force, so 16. So we do 16 by 20, we divide it by 20. We can simplify this fraction, so we can go to 4 divided by 5, which is 80%. When we look at year 2, it's the same thing, but it's 19 divided by 25. Now, I don't know how good your maths is, but you don't have a calculator, and I can't work that fraction out. But what we can do is use a little mind trick and think, well, if we added 1 to the 19 here, that would be 20 divided by 25, which would be 80%. But because it's 19, that's likely to be less than 8. Well, it's going to be less than 80%. Okay. Hopefully the question you get on your exam is a lot easier than this. I pray it will be. So the answer is A, I think. Double check that. All right, yeah. So in the next video, we're going to look at international economy, our favorite. See you then.